So today's lecture is pretty straightforward. It's how to write an anthropology paper, how to write a good paper without really trying too hard. Of course, the first question comes, why do you want to write a good paper? I mean, you're going to say, well, I need a good grade, but really, let's go a little deeper than that. When you write a good paper, that's your opportunity to demonstrate your understanding. Because in anthropology, it's not the type of discipline that you can grade with a true, false, multiple choice, even short answer. The only way that I can ascertain that you understand the material is that you put it in your own words and you give it back to me in a fashion that is structured and well organized and well written. This also establishes your authority on the subject. But more than anything, this is the one big skill you're going to get out of college. When you finish and you have your bachelor's degree and you go out and you want to get a job, they're going to look and they say, okay, you've got a degree that proves three things actually. One, you can write. Two, you can probably communicate verbally. And three, you can accomplish tasks. So the first thing I want to talk about is contractions, and I don't want you to use contractions. The problem with contractions is that it generates a lot of your mistakes. A lot of your word errors are going to come because you're thinking of contractions, and I'll show you some specifics for that. It also makes your writing too informal. At a collegiate level, you should be writing formally, and so it is had not, does not doesn't, not hasn't. Also, and this is one of my huge pet peeves, and the first time I ever saw it was on a hockey discussion board, and I kind of excused it there, but I've been getting papers the last decade of people actually writing this. Could of, C-O-U-L-D space of, would of, should of. Those aren't words. That's not even English. It's could have, which would then be shortened in a contraction to could have, but not could of. And so if you don't use contractions, you'll never make that particular mistake. So do not use contractions. I also want you to know the meaning of every word in your paper. If there's something in your paper that doesn't make sense to you, how is it supposed to make sense to anyone else? I once was grading a PowerPoint presentation from some students, and I had a student back up to a specific slide, and I asked him about a specific word that he had just read out in the slide. And I said, and what does that mean? He goes, I don't know. I just put it in there because it looked like it belonged. The whole idea behind writing a paper is to demonstrate your knowledge. And so make sure that the big sounding words that you use are the right words. English is an interesting language in that we don't have any true synonyms, and it's a huge language. And my favorite example of this is the word suspect or suspect. As recently as the 1930s, both a suspect in a crime and someone making a suspicion, in other words, suspecting something, were both pronounced suspect. Police would say, I'm going to go round up the usual suspects. But over the last 80 years, the word has now been split into two words, spelled the same, two completely different meanings, and here's where it poses a problem. Let's say I type in the word suspect, or suspect, doesn't matter. I put the cursor on it. I hit Shift F7, which will bring up the thesaurus. It will bring up all of the words that have similar meanings to both suspect and suspect. And if I pick the wrong one, if I pick one that is for the other pronunciation of the word, because I really don't know, I'm just kind of trying to break up my paper so it doesn't keep saying suspect, 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 I'm going to make no sense whatsoever. So I have to make sure that the word I choose has the meaning that I intend. So always make sure that you pick the word that means the closest to what you're actually trying to say. Your class may have an observation paper. Well, you are the authority on that observation. You're going to tell me what you saw, when you saw it, and what you think it means. You can't take the I out of that. We're not doing objective third person here. We're doing ethnography. And so I belongs there. Where it doesn't belong is in phrases like I think, in my opinion, I have to say, I feel. You know, you can string out 3 or 4 lines on a page by going, well, in my humble opinion, based on what was assigned by Dr. Eissinger in the 3 books that we read, and then list the 3 titles and their publishers and their publication dates and all of that stuff. This is what I think it may mean. Now, you have covered your butt, but you haven't said anything. You've wasted 2 or 3 or 4 lines of a paper that could be used for actually useful information. And if you have stuff in your paper that doesn't add to the overall theme of the paper, then it needs to be deleted. So when you interject yourself into an anthropology paper, it is in relation to your observations and to the ways that you're applying the theory that we're going to talk about. We are, like I said, we are a qualitative discipline. Ethnography is our primary tool. You cannot be removed from the ethnography. So if you're doing an observation paper, it requires field work. I expect that paper to be written from the standpoint of the first person. Now, the reverse of that is the word you. And we'll often use phrases like, history's so boring you fall asleep in class. What if the reader doesn't fall asleep in class? And so he or she reads what you wrote there and goes, well, you know, they're full of crap on that. They don't know me at all. And if they're wrong on their assumptions about me, what else are they wrong about? Really, when you put the you in there, it really runs the risk of you actually blowing your credibility out of the water. I want to just take a real basic rule, and this is how I expect to see them in your papers. I want simple numbers written out as words. So words like 10, 25, 300, 1 million. If you need to have more complex numbers, like 945, 1,986, 53,432, then write them out as digits. The reason for that is that we read words as patterns, but we have to read numbers, each individual number. Specific numbers, detailed numbers, become complex and hard to read because you have to break it down number by number by number. You're prone to error. You also need to assess whether or not you need that level of specificity. For example, 945 is almost 1,000. 1986 is almost 2,000. Approximately 2,000. 53,434 is more than 53,000. More than 50,000. The only time you would really need that level of specificity is if you are comparing something that's 53,432 and 53,596. Then that specificity matters. But if you're just in general terms using these numbers, round them, and if you can round them into a simple number, then write them out as words. You will never do wrong by writing it as a simple number and writing it out as words. Now this goes back to something I already alluded to, and that's that every sentence should have meaning. A lot of times what I do is I will write my papers twice as long as they need to be. If I'm writing a conference paper, which what I do is I write a publication paper. I write a 25 to 30 page paper. And then I edit that down to 8 to 12 pages. Because that way I know I got everything in it. And then I go through and I remove the redundancies, I remove the things that are no longer essential, and you keep honing and honing and honing. And when you do that, what you end up with is a very solid finished paper. If you have an 8-page paper to write and you write 7 pages, you haven't come anywhere near to the amount of information that you needed to include in that 8-page paper. So always overwrite. This is another reason to write early. And then go back and start chopping out the redundancies, remove the excess words, trim it down to the tightest and most cogent form that you can make it. Now, punctuation really, really matters. Let's start with ellipses, ... Many of us stick those in to denote a pause. That's wrong. We actually have punctuation marks that denote pauses. The comma, and in many cases, the semicolon. The ellipse, the ... means that there's something missing in the text, in a quote. It's the only time you would use it would be inside a quote. So let's say you have a long quote, and many times when we're looking at stuff, we really are only looking at the first part of the sentence up to the first comma and the last part of the sentence from the last comma on. That's really the nut of the sentence, with everything else in the middle just being exposition. And so as long as you can remove all of that stuff in the middle, but not change the meaning of what you're still using, you can connect those two pieces with just ... And then, of course, stick on your citation and all the stuff at the end. So you can use those ellipses to edit down the long quotes so that you have just the part you want your reader to focus on. Now, if you have words in quotation marks in a written document, if there are quotation marks, it must have a citation Now, when you and I are talking, I might, do air quotes, right? Lift my hands and do my fingers in like a rabbit ears and go air quotes. You can't do that in paper because quotes have a different meaning. What you're trying to do is add emphasis, in which in writing you would use bold, italics, underline. Any of those will add emphasis. So when we're talking, we can't really underline a word or put them in italics, so we use the air quotes. But in written English is different than spoken English, and in written English, that's right, you have to just simply do it the right way. Do not put quotation marks around something you want to have emphasized. Italicize it, or bold it, or underline it. Now, make sure that you write the right word, right? Here's some common examples. To, and to. The first one, usually when I do this in a face-to-face class, I have the students try to answer these. But let's go through this. So to, the first to, to, means, of course, it's a relationship. I'm going to the store, right? It's a relationship. It's a distance. It's a connector. TOO means either also or it has to do with size, right? It's too big. It's too small. And the third one, of course, is the letter, or is the number 2, TWO. Now, the next group is one of the ones that causes most students the most problems. There, 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 THEIR, and there, THEY''RE. Now, I've already told you you're not using contractions. So that third one doesn't exist in your vocabulary in this class, or probably in any of your classes. It shouldn't exist. So you're going to use the first two. Now, I don't know how many papers I've seen over the years where this is wrong. And I hate to admit it, but I was 48 years old before I realized that THERE, the word there, which is about a place, it is positional, it is spatial. THERE has within it HERE. Here. Here and there. You should never get those two words mixed up again. The THEIR, there, that's the one that has to do with possession. So you really only have to learn the one, THERE, its relation to position. The other one is what you use for possession, and you're never going to use a third one. Your and your. Your, of course, is possession, and the next one is a contraction, so we don't really care. You're never, ever going to use it. Now, this is one I see all the time. Then and than. Then, again, is sequential. It's temporal. It's about time. It's about this happened, then that happened, then this happened. Than is a comparison. This is bigger than that. So one has to do with sequence or time, and the other one has to do with comparison. It's and its. Now this is one of the hardest ones in the whole bunch. IT' is a contraction for it is, so you'll never use it. ITS is the possessive. I know it should have an apostrophe, but then the two words would look exactly the same, and it would be even more confusing. So possessive is ITS, IT''S doesn't exist in your lexicon when you're writing a paper for my class, or probably for any class. And then whose and whose. And again, this is one of those confusing ones. The who''S is not possessive. It's the contraction of who is. WHOSE, the second one on your screen, is actually the word that is the possessive form of the word who. A couple other notes before we leave this slide. You got to write in complete sentences. You need to have a subject and a verb and some forms of modifiers. So a few years ago, an English professor wrote, quote, "A woman without her man is nothing." No punctuation. Put it up on the board and he asked his students to punctuate it correctly. Every male in the class wrote, "A woman without her man is nothing." And yet all the women in the class wrote, "A woman without her man is nothing." exactly the same words, completely opposite meanings, and the only thing that's different is the punctuation. So punctuation is powerful. Now, everything happens throughout time. There are many ways to write papers. The easiest, especially for us, is chronologically. This is true for history. This is pretty true for sociology. It's true for anthropology. It's pretty much true for all of the humanities. The simplest, most direct, and most easily understood method of writing something is in order, in sequence, chronologically. You can write thematically, but it's much, much harder. Many times when you're writing thematically, you end up writing chronologically within each of those little themes. And so remember to try to keep things in some sort of logical progression. Because if you don't, it actually gets so confusing for the reader that they have no idea what you're talking about. Normally, everything that you're going to write about, even if you're writing about your observation or your own field work, has already happened. And use simple past tense. All the past tenses that end in ed. Don't use past tenses, imperfect past tenses that use the was and the ing. He was fighting, he was dying, he was doing this, or he would do this. Any of the verb to be with with an ing on the end of the verb, because that means that at the moment you're referring to, they're in the act of doing it. So if he was dying in 1945, he died for the whole year, and he may not be dead yet. And so that was-ing means that it was taking place at a specific time. And that if you mean that, then that's what you should write. But I would bet that 90% of the time, you're going to write about something that happened in the past. Now, you might say that the door closed while 14 people were trying to get in. There's a purpose there for that was and the ing. But most of the time, we're going to go simple past tense. Prepositional phrases. These are wonderful for poetry. They make things sound pretty. He wore jeans of blue. He wore blue jeans is a lot more direct. If I wanted to, I could leave the word blue out and just say he wore jeans. If he's wearing any other color of jeans, then I would say it, right? He was wearing green jeans, gray jeans, brown jeans, black jeans. But if he was wearing blue jeans, and I just say he was wearing jeans, you're going to be pretty certain that it's indigo blue, because that's what most jeans are. You're going to tell me, well, I write the way I talk. Well, that's too bad, because I guarantee you, you do not drive your car the way you ride your bicycle. They both have two pedals. They both have a thing to steer. But if you try to alternate between the brake and the accelerator like you do on the left and right pedals of your bike, riding in your car is going to really suck. It's important to understand that these are two completely different skills. Written English follows more formal rules than spoken English. And it's not like I want your personality to disappear. You will still come through. In fact, you'll come through clearer if you write more formally. As I said before, the ability to write is one of the three big things you're going to get out of college. Consider the fact that a bachelor's degree and that ability to write, that is one of the primary results of getting that degree, that over the course of your life it will guarantee a minimum of an additional $1 million of income. Now, unfortunately, they don't give it to you all up front, but if spread out across your career, you will make $1 million more than someone who can't write. Subjects and verbs must agree. If your subject is plural, and your verb must also be plural. It can't be singular in one and plural in the other. Also, one of the things that makes me crazy is the his/her, especially if we're talking about multiple genders beyond the binary that we use in this country. So what you want to do is make your nouns plural instead of the his or her, or make it as generic as you can using the they. So you can say an anthropologist loves his books or her books. Doesn't matter. You can do either way. Or make it plural. Anthropologists love their books. Now, In the past, using their for singular was a huge no-no. But in 2017, the Associated Press Style Guide, which is the universal style guide for journalism, and it's also applied, it's kind of kept as a log of this is how English is working right now. This year, because of issues with multiple genders, with trans people, the his and hers don't really work. It's a binary in a more fluid environment. And so they have, the AP has made a huge change, and you can now talk about an individual and use their as the pronoun. If you literally couldn't get out of bed, then you're either tied down or you're quadriplegic. We just don't say, I virtually died of boredom. First time you use somebody's name, you use the entire name and title. So it would be the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And then every subsequent reference to that person is King. Now, if you're talking about Coretta Scott King and Martin Luther King, you would use their full titles the first time, and then from then on it would be Dr. King and Mrs. King. Now, if she's a doctor, then you got to add the first names in. You don't ever refer to people by their first names. As I've said before, with rare exception, your topic is in the past. Has, should, if you're going to write the word has, check for had. Says, said. Is, was. Consider the date of the source when it was written in relation to the present and adjust as needed. If the source you're saying says it uses lives or says, but the stuff was at the end of the 19th century, you have to change the tense and make it past tense. And I have a pet peeve here. Authors don't say, unless it's a speech. If you're going to cite the I Have a Dream speech, then Dr. King said. But if you're referring to the letters from Birmingham jail, he wrote, he posited, he put forth, he asserted, he did all kinds of stuff, but he didn't say anything. It's a written document. Also, and I've argued with some of my colleagues on this, and we have different opinions, but in my class, papers don't discuss, because as far as I'm concerned, a discussion takes 2 or more people. And so your paper doesn't discuss, nor are you going to discuss in that paper anything, unless it's a co-written paper, in which case then you might have a discussion. But 99% of the time, your paper isn't going to discuss, neither are you. If a source uses a different term than what's in common use today, and this is especially important with looking at sources pertaining to race and ethnicity, we use different terms than we used 100 years ago, even different terms than we used 50 years ago. And so if you're citing a source, and for example, for African Americans in this country, and you're using a source from the 20s or the 30s, it's going to refer to the Negro and colored people. And that's perfectly acceptable in that context, if you're quoting it. However, when you refer to people of African descent who live in the United States, they're either black or African American, because those are the terms that we use today. Part of showing me that you understand what you're talking about is that you use contemporary terms even in the light of historical terms that are different. Now, I give one real quick example. A few years ago, I was teaching African American Studies at West Hills down in Lemoore, and I had a student using a slave narrative. One of the assignments was to take a slave narrative and to analyze it and write a short paper. They had some other stuff to put in it, but it was based on a slave narrative. And when you're writing an interview, when you're doing a life history or you're doing an oral history interview, you want your transcript to match the dialect and the pronunciation of your subject. And so if they have a heavy accent, you type the words that way. I mean, if they use bad grammar, you put it down verbatim. Don't correct the grammar, don't correct the pronunciation. You make it so that if I read that, I can hear as much as possible the original subject's voice. And so in this particular instance, they were talking about harvesting. And in the slave narrative, it referred to going out and harvesting the cawn, the C-A-W-N. Now, my poor student didn't know what that was. She didn't ask. She didn't try to figure it out in any other way, and she couldn't get it from the context. And so, outside of the quotes, in her commentary about the slave narrative, she kept referring to the cawn, C-A-W-N, which indicated to me she had no idea what she was talking about. Now, specifics. Every paper you write for me needs to be double-spaced. Indent the first line 1/2 inch. No extra space between paragraphs. No cover page or folder. I really only need the name, the date, and the course info. I want it in the upper left or right-hand corner. That needs to be single-spaced. Why waste all that real estate? I want 1-inch margins, not 1 1/4, not 1 1/2, not 3/4, 1-inch margins all around. And I want pages numbered. Now, look at the dialog box that I've put on your right-hand side of the screen. This is almost the proper way, but this is probably the way that your Word is already set up. And the part that I'm most interested in is in the spacing, the before and the after. You notice that says 8 point? That is the default for Word, because Word was originally developed for business correspondence, not for academic correspondence, or academic papers. And in business correspondence, you tend to not indent the first line of every paragraph, but you leave space between paragraphs. It's a very different style of writing. In an academic setting, you don't do that. The indent is what tells you that you've got a new paragraph. And so that, where it says after, you should reset that to 0. Citations are required. You must have a works cited page. If not, you get a 0. You must have citations, inline citations, or you will get a 0. If they are not in Chicago inline format, you will get a 0. Do not give me MLA, APA, Turabian, anything else. I want Chicago inline format only. You will have inline citations and a works cited page, because a works cited page only includes the works you actually cited. So for everything you cited, there must be an entry in the back, and for everything in the back, there must be a citation inline. Reference pages we're not going to use. A reference page is everything that you relied on to shape your thinking. You may not have cited it, you might not have paraphrased it, you might not have used any facts, you might not have taken anything directly out of it, but you read it as part of what you did to prepare for that paper. That's a reference page. A bibliography is just a list of books on a specific subject. You may not have read any of them. You might not have even cited any of them. And so what we're doing is a work cited page. So as we wrap this up, I want you to consider a couple of things before you're finished with your paper. No paper is ever finished after the first draft. You need to write your papers early so that you can take some time off before you start proofing it, because your brain will actually make the corrections when you're reading it. You won't see the mistakes when the paper is fresh in your head. You need to get away from it long enough so that when you come back to it, it's fresh. Even though it's your work, you're approaching it without the preconceived notions in your head. Read it hours or days later. See if it makes any sense. Have a friend read it. Take it to the writing lab. Bring it to me. If you bring it to me early enough, and if I have time, I'll go through it with you. But you really do need to have that split. That's why you can write a paper and then come back and shrink it by half, because you will find those mistakes. You'll find those redundancies and that padding, and you'll be able to take it out. Whereas if you read it right after you've written it, it all makes sense. It's the best paper you've ever written. Another way to do the proofing is to read the paper out loud. And normally what I do is I ask somebody else to read the paper to me, because that way all of the inflections and all the punctuation and all of the missed words and all of the bad grammar will just stand out, because I can hear it. I'm not reading it, I'm just listening to it. If you don't have a friend that can read, Windows has a function called Narrator. There's a similar function in the Macintosh machines. And this is essentially a text-to-speech generator. And these use electronic speech tools. And they're pretty flat, but there's actually an advantage to that, because it uses punctuation to try to do the phrasing so that it can sound somewhat human. So if there's a question mark, it goes up at the end of the sentence. If there are commas, there's a pause. And so you can hear exactly how the paper is structured. That flat voice, that flat electronic voice really shows a lot of the errors. So it's another way to do it. Even if you've done it, if you had somebody else read it to you, you might want to run it through again just to see if by any chance you missed something else. And trust me, you will always miss something. So these are just the last checks, right? Before you turn the paper into me, it should have been gone through multiple times, often by multiple people, and in using different modalities. So hopefully you now know how to write a great anthropology paper without really trying. Here you now know how to what I expect to see when I get your papers, and I can't wait to see them now.